What is up, guys? It is Quinn here, back with another video. A few days ago, I put out my way too early 2023 top 12 running backs. Today, same style of video, but we're going to be going through the top 12 wide receivers. Wide receiver position, honestly, a lot deeper than the running backs. So we did have some tough calls here. Like I said, in the last video, very early on in the offseason, these are going to change. There's still some things we got to work out. Some of these wide receivers may have new quarterbacks. Maybe they're dealing with new competition. A lot of things can switch up. So these are just my initial thoughts. As always, I want to hear what you guys think. So, let me know. Do I have a guy too high, too low? Did I leave someone off the list? All of that stuff, so comment down below. If you guys enjoy, do me a huge favor, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. Over the next week or so, I'm going to start getting into the rookie rankings, so looking at, top running backs, wide receivers, quarterbacks, tight ends, all of that. But let's just jump right into it. And I think number one this year at wide receiver, I think it's going to be pretty consensus. For me, I have Justin Jefferson. I think that's where a lot of people are going to look. He had a monster 2022 season. He was the wide receiver one in total points. When I'm referencing points and points per game, it's going to be half point PPR, a nice in between PPR and standard. But Justin Jefferson targeted 184 times, caught 128 of those, went for a little over 1,800 yards, and then had 9 total touchdowns. He was number one in targets, receptions, receiving yards, and yards after the catch. So just dominant across the board. And I mean, it's possible he can improve. If we're looking at Justin Jefferson's career in 10 years, I would be pretty surprised if this was his best season. The dude is 24 years old. He is still getting better. And I think the one number that we could see a jump in is that touchdown number, right? 9 total touchdowns, that's nothing to sneeze at. But when you're getting targeted 184 times, if you're leading all wide receivers in red zone targets, Justin Jefferson is going to have a season where he's catching 15, 16, 17 touchdowns. That could be here in 2023. But in my opinion, it is tough to nail the number one guy because you're picking one guy, against the field. You have all these other, super talented wide receivers. But in my opinion, if I had to place a bet on who's going to be the wide receiver one for 2023, it would be Justin Jefferson. Now, moving over to number two, this is where I have Ja'Marr Chase. I feel like this is probably going to be a conversation between two players, and I'm going to get into the next guy at number three. But looking at Ja'Marr Chase, he's coming off of a fantasy season where he was the wide receiver 5 in points per game. He didn't play a full season. I think he missed, I think it was 5 games. But I mean, he was right in the mix with guys like Tyreek Hill and Davante Adams when it came to fantasy points per game. And he's kind of lined up on this Justin Jefferson trajectory where he's just a year behind Jefferson in terms of NFL experience. But we saw Jefferson take that huge leap in year 3. I think we could see Ja'Marr Chase come out, have a massive year 3 also. It just kind of seems inevitable that Joe Burrow is going to win an MVP over these next few seasons. If Joe Burrow is going to win MVP, he's going to put up monster numbers. Ja'Marr Chase, as his wide receiver 1, also going to match, that production with monster numbers. So I like Ja'Marr Chase here at number 2. And then at number 3, the guy who I think is going to be in talks for that wide receiver 2 spot, or maybe even wide receiver 1, it's going to be Cooper Kupp. So if you were someone who had Cooper Kupp ranked at number 2, I really wouldn't push back. I mean, the dude actually averaged more points per game than Justin Jefferson, albeit it was in 9 games. But I mean, he was on track to put together another monster season. His, year ends up being cut short due to an ankle injury. For me, when I'm comparing Kupp to a guy like Ja'Marr Chase or even Justin Jefferson, I just think he has a few minor concerns that Jefferson and Chase do not have. Kupp is going to be 30, heading into this 2023 season. And now I don't think Kupp is going to fall off a cliff. It's possible, he just maintains the exact same production. But it's also possible, maybe his production slips slightly. Instead of being a top 3 wide receiver, maybe he's in that wide receiver 6 territory. Like I said, not saying, he's going to fall off a cliff or anything, but, it's just not a concern that we have with a guy like Jefferson or Chase, who are still very, very young. And then the other slight concern would just be the health of Matthew Stafford. Right now, it seems like he is set on coming back. But I mean, when we start talking about head and neck injuries, there's definitely, a little bit of concern there. But like I said, I'm nitpicking here. That's kind of what we have to do because all these dudes at the top are just absolute studs. Now, moving into number 4, I think basically 4 through 6, it's going to be players in a similar tier. all are going to be, NFL veterans. So at number 4, this is where I have Tyreek Hill. He finished as the wide receiver 3 in points per game in his first season with the Dolphins. Full transparency, I was not super high on Hill coming into the season. I think I had him around like wide receiver 9, 10, 11. Definitely look foolish with that take, after seeing how dominant he was. Number 3 in targets, number 2 in target share, number 1 in target rate, number 2 in air yards, number 1 in deep targets, number 2 in receptions, number 1 in yards per route run. The dude was, putting it together all over the place. We know Mike McDaniel is going to feed him. He's going to give him opportunities. We know Tyreek Hill is a big play monster, so got to like him there as a higher end wide receiver 1. Then after him at number 5, I have Stefon Diggs. He was the wide receiver 6 in points per game, right there in that mix with Tyreek Hill, Jamar Chase, Davante Adams. All those dudes kind of clumped up in terms of half-point PPR points per game. I think Stefon Diggs is still a very strong mid-tier wide receiver 1 who does have some of that high-end upside, where if he was the number 1, number 2 guy in 2023, I really wouldn't be shocked. We know he's attached to the stud quarterback. If Josh Allen's your quarterback, you're going to have a solid offense. I also think the Bills could upgrade this wide receiver room. And, inherently you may hear that and think, oh, they're going to bring in competition. It's not great for Stefon Diggs. In my opinion, if they brought in a solid wide receiver 2, I think it would actually help Stefon Diggs. I know there are a lot of people out there who really do like Gabe Davis, but straight up, Gabe Davis is not a wide receiver 2 on a top offense. He was kind of just pushed into that role. He's more of a number 3, number 4, in a good offense. So if they bring in a solid guy, maybe take some looks away from Stefon Diggs, raise the ceiling of that offense altogether, I do like Stefon Diggs at number 5. Now looking at number 6, this is where I have Davante Adams, and we all know that Adams is an absolute stud. He's coming off of another big season, his first with the Raiders. For me and Davante Adams here, I think his 2023 ranking is really just going to come down to what quarterback he's playing with. I think that's going to be a big part of where he falls. Even if he's with a bad quarterback, he's still going to be in the mid-tier wide receiver 1 range. But if he gets reunited with Aaron Rodgers, I think he could get bumped up, or maybe he's traded to a favorable landing spot. I think all these things would help his ranking. It's also possible he just ends up being stuck in a rough quarterback situation. Maybe the Raiders try to kind of keep their head above 500. They bring in a veteran like Jimmy G or something like that. While that wouldn't be terrible, it's definitely not something that's going to give Davante Adams this crazy high ceiling. So in the right fit, I do actually think he could be in that wide receiver 2 to 4 range. I mean, if you're giving Davante Adams a stud quarterback back with Aaron Rodgers, whatever it is, I think you probably could argue him as high as a wide receiver 2. Now looking at number 7, I have CeeDee Lamb, and I've been someone who's just been a little bit lower on CeeDee Lamb than consensus. I did kind of get on board heading into this most recent season, and he finally had his first kind of breakout season, establishing himself as a fantasy wide receiver 1. He was the wide receiver 8 in points per game. Just a super well-rounded season altogether. 156 targets, 107 receptions, 1,359 receiving yards, and then 9 total touchdowns. And we also have to remember, this wasn't a peak season from CeeDee Lamb. It's not like everything came together perfectly. It's not like Dak played amazing. Dak missed time early on in the season and then kind of struggled once he came back. So I think CeeDee Lamb still does actually have room to grow here. Now looking at number 8, this is where I have A.J. Brown, and full transparency, I was too low on A.J. Brown heading into 2022. I didn't really love the fit with the Eagles. I didn't think Jalen Hurts was going to take his massive step forward. I really like Jalen Hurts as a fantasy option. I didn't think he was going to be as strong of a passer as he was, so I missed on him there. He had really great production in his first year with the Eagles. He was the wide receiver 7 in points per game. I think that offense is going to be a very strong unit once again. We know Jalen Hurts can support guys like A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith. It's also possible that A.J. Brown could be in line to see some more touchdown upside, especially on the goal line. We have the NFL considering outlawing that quarterback push thing, which did, give Jalen Hurts some extra touchdown upside on the goal line. Maybe that bumps up his touchdowns by 1 or 2. but that could be the difference between him being the wide receiver 9 and like the wide receiver 7. So I like A.J. Brown here as like a firm mid-tier wide receiver 1. Then behind him, I have Amon-Ra St. Brown here at number 9. When we're looking at kind of like tiers, talked about like Justin Jefferson at number 1, then we have Chase, Kupp in there, and then like the Hill, Diggs, Davante Adams tier. I think there's a solid tier of CeeDee Lamb, A.J. Brown, and Amon-Ra St. Brown. I kind of have those guys clumped together here. I'm very high on Amon-Ra. I basically liked him as a kind of trade target early on in the season when he was dealing with some injuries, some limited touchdown performances. But overall in the season, he finished as the wide receiver 9 in points per game. But when you actually dive a little bit deeper into his season, he actually left 2 games with injuries after playing less than 35% of the snaps. So if you remove those 2 games, from his point per game average, he actually averaged 15 half-point PPR points per game, which was the same as A.J. Brown. I feel like he's kind of consistently viewed as, a guy under A.J. Brown, but he was right in the mix with the A.J. Browns, the CeeDee Lambs. He likely will have some more target competition heading into 2023. We'll likely see Jameson Williams more involved in this offense, but I'm still very confident that Amon-Ra is going to be a stud, regardless of the competition around him. Now we get into the double digits. Top 10, Jaylen Waddle here at number 10. He's coming off of a very impressive sophomore season. It's really interesting the way his usage kind of flipped up. In college, he was like this, huge, big play threat. And then his rookie season, he was used as like a weird, like limited ceiling, kind of like a target hog, a real guy who's getting a ton of volume, but not a ton of big plays. There wasn't a ton of explosion. And then here in his sophomore season, Mike McDaniel comes in and Jaylen Waddle goes back to his college usage and is just a big play machine. He led the NFL in yards per target and yards per reception. He finished as the wide receiver 13 in points per game. Should continue to improve as a young wide receiver. Hopefully we don't have to deal with any more like Tua concussion issues, because Jaylen Waddle's production definitely did fall a little bit when the QB1 was out. But I do like Jaylen Waddle here as a top 10 fantasy wide receiver. And then at number 11, this is where I have T. Higgins. This may be surprising to some people because on paper, he didn't have like this crazy, great fantasy season. He was the wide receiver 19 in points per game, which like mid-tier wide receiver 2, that's solid, but that's not what you were expecting out of T. Higgins when you drafted him. However, kind of like what we did with Amon-Ra St. Brown, if we dig a little deeper, Higgins had 3 different games where he was limited with injuries. In week 1, this is the one that's probably, a little more forgotten about. He left early on after only playing 26% of the snaps. And then if you were someone who had T. Higgins on your team, you probably definitely remember week 5 and week 14. Those were the 2 games where he was active. And then, you're kind of watching the game and he's just standing there on the sideline and not getting in. In those games, he had a 16% snap share and then 1%. So the dude basically was not playing, especially in that second one. So that's 3 different games where he's dealing with injuries, not playing. And, those are reflected in his point per game number where he's literally just not giving you anything in terms of production. Without those games, he goes from the wide receiver, 19, to the wide receiver 9. So when he was healthy, he was, a dude who was locked in. He was giving you wide receiver 1 production. And this is a spot where it's frustrating. He was dealing with these injuries. He was probably hurting you in your lineups. But this is not something that you can project moving forward. It's not like every year we're going to have T. Higgins, limited in 3 games with injuries. Sometimes it happens. You get injured early on in the game. You leave. You're banged up throughout the season. Whatever it is, I don't think there's something that is going to haunt T. Higgins moving forward. So I actually have him and Waddle very close back to back. But I would expect Higgins to probably go maybe half a round to a full round after Jaylen Waddle in drafts. And then for Higgins here, the one concern in the offseason is that them and the Bengals aren't able to come to terms on an extension and maybe he gets traded. That's definitely not something you want when you're looking at fantasy value because he's in a really strong spot connected to Joe Burrow. It's possible he can go be the wide receiver 1 somewhere and really ball out, but it's also possible he gets moved to an unfavorable landing spot. Personally, I'm a Chicago Bears fan, really like Justin Fields, as a fantasy option, but in terms of a guy who's going to support a T. Higgins, would much rather him stay in the Bengals, but he could find a different landing spot that's also very solid for him. Now, looking at number 12, this was probably the toughest spot to rank just because, this is the cutoff. This is where you have to leave some people off, and I actually did go back and forth on a few different players here. I ended up settling with Amari Cooper, and I think most people are not going to have Amari Cooper ranked this high. When I was initially doing my rankings, I actually didn't have him in this spot. And then, I just kept digging, looking at some more stats, and I had honestly forgotten how impressive of a season Amari Cooper had in a season with very, very poor quarterback play. Talking about Jacoby Brissett early on, and then Deshaun Watson, who was not good later on in the season. Amari Cooper still managed to finish as the wide receiver 15 in points per game. Now, the tough part here with Cooper is that his 2023 production, obviously he's going to have a role in it, but in terms of him being a wide receiver 1, you're basically betting on Deshaun Watson, right? If Deshaun Watson returns to his 2020 form, Cooper's likely going to be a value if he's drafted as like a high to mid-tier wide receiver 2. Now, if we see the 2022 version of Deshaun Watson, who was not good, looked like a shell of his former self, then Cooper will likely be a disappointment. For me, I'm willing to bet that the year and a half plus off for Watson, that's the reason why he struggled. The dude was a stud his first, 3-4 years of his career. So I'm not willing to just, totally throw him away. Now, if you're just completely anti-Watson, I understand that. There's plenty of reasons to be. But for me, I ended up slotting Amari Cooper in here. Let me know who you guys would have thrown in here. I do have some honorable mentions just to kind of toss out. The guy I originally had in here before I put in Amari Cooper, it was Davante Smith. Totally reasonable for Davante Smith to be in here, kind of in that T. Higgins role, capped in terms of being the wide receiver 1, but can be a very solid wide receiver, on a top offense. Also had Garrett Wilson thrown in there. I will say that if Aaron Rodgers goes to the Jets, I think you could throw Garrett Wilson in the top 12 for sure. Even a guy like Derek Carr, maybe Garrett Wilson is slotting in there as a top 12 wide receiver. Even if he's not, he's in that 13, 14. I think you could consider Debo coming off of a down year, but we know he has, that wide receiver 1 talent. DeAndre Hopkins in the right landing spot, if he gets traded to a favorable spot, could be a number 12. And then I also, not really someone who I considered for number 12, but just kind of wanted to give a shout out to Calvin Ridley, who I'm probably going to be very high on heading into 2023, coming back from that suspension with Trevor Lawrence at quarterback on that ascending offense. I think he's someone who's very, very interesting for fantasy purposes. But that is going to wrap it up for the top 12. Let me know what you guys think. Like I said in my last video, trying to get 2 to 3 videos out per week, probably more of that 3 number. But thank you all again for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.